The comedian Emo Phillips is credited with writing the greatest joke about religion ever. This isn't me saying it. This is a poll taken around the world. There is nearly universal agreement that this is the greatest religious joke ever. I will share it with you now. Once I saw this guy on a bridge about to jump. And I said, "Don't do it." He said, "But nobody loves me." And I said, "God loves you. Do you believe in God?" And he said, "Yes, I do." And I said, "Me too. Are you Christian or Jewish?" "Christian." I said, "Me too." And I said, "Which franchise are you?" And he said, "Baptist." And I said, "Me too. Northern Baptist or Southern Baptist?" And he said, "Northern Baptist." And I said, "Me too. Northern Baptist conservative or Northern Baptist liberal?" And he said, "Northern Baptist conservative." And I said, "Me too. Northern Baptist conservative Great Lakes region or Northern Conservative Baptist Eastern region?" He said, "Northern Conservative Baptist Great Lakes region." And I said, "Me too. Northern Conservative Baptist Great Lakes Region Council of 1879 or Northern Conservative Baptist Great Lakes Region Council of 1912? He said, "Northern Conservative Baptist Great Lakes Region Council of 1912. And I said, "Die, heretic!" And I pushed him off. I pushed him off the bridge. The season of Lent is an invitation to reflect on who we are and who we would like to become. It's a season that offers spiritual insights and practices that can assist us in evolving as humans. To use the language of our tradition, it's a time to recognize ourselves as God's beloved so we can follow God's call to serve God's beloved in the world. And the first temptation that Jesus faces in the desert shows us the first obstacle in our journey of faith. The first stumbling block we come across is the temptation to be so certain of who we are that we are unable to grow into who God calls us to be. It was early in the morning. It was that time between dark and light, just as the sun was about to peek over the horizon, but before he could make out the shape of anything in the shadows. The young carpenter had fasted for 40 days and 40 nights. He was in some state between asleep and awake. The night had not yet ended and the day had not yet begun, and he knew he was not alone. There was someone there with him. He had been uncomfortable and uncertain for 40 days and 40 nights, and in this place between nowhere and somewhere, in the space between who he had been and who he would become, he heard a voice say to him, "Just who do you think you are?" The Son of God could turn stones into loaves of bread. Can you do that? Is that who you are? The young man made it clear that he was not interested in proving himself. He said, "I can't live on bread alone. I can only be filled by every word that comes from God." That was the morning when Jesus of Nazareth became God's partner in the unfolding narrative of human history. And that shadowy figure, that shapeless tempter, forever certain of who he was and how the world works, he became known by a different name, a name that means stumbling block, a name that we most often refer to as the devil. In the uncertain world we face, we are constantly tempted to be certain. The former president of Andover Newton Theological School, Nick Carter, he said on numerous occasions, the opposite of faith is not doubt, but certainty. Perhaps this is why certainty is the first temptation, the first stumbling block of the faith journey. Are you sure about all this? What if it's not true? What if everything you believe in and hope for is proven wrong? Too often, we become concerned with being on the right side of the debate, convincing others of our righteousness and certainty. Jesus shows us in this first trial in the desert the best way to resist certainty. The best way to resist certainty is to not place our identity in the right column, to be among the winners. The way to resist certainty is to make our identity the dialogue itself. We don't live on bread alone. We live on every word that comes from the mouth of God. When we identify as being part of the conversation, part of the ongoing unfolding of humanity, we get the room we need to stand up for who we are and what we believe, and continue to have room to grow, to evolve, to be led where God is calling us. Our identity is when we get caught between what the world says and what God says. Our identity is where we get caught between what we say about ourselves and what others say about us. When we are able to resist the temptation to be certain, when we are able to say no to all of these options, we find something new unfolding. There's an African-American writer named Hari Ziad. Hari Ziad has written about the experience of being an African-American with white friends. Ziad writes this: "At many points along my journey, white people became friends, teachers, or parts of other important relationships with me. Relationships that I increasingly realized needed to be navigated with a more contextual understanding of the racist system in which we were all partaking. As that awareness grew, so did my understanding of my friends, teachers, and acquaintances and their complicity in racism. As these relationships were important to me, my attempts to share that understanding with them increased. But I regularly came up against strong resistance. The conversation usually went something like this. Ziad would say, well, white people need to stop doing racist things. White person: not all white people are bad. Ziad: well, not all white people are bad, but all white people need to stop doing racist things. White person: but I'm not racist. Ziad: all white people benefit from racism and can be racist. That doesn't mean you are a bad person. White person: no, I'm a good person who loves black people. I'm not racist. Ziad: no one is saying you're not a good person, but you need to take responsibility for how racism continues to exist. You can be a good person and do that. White person: I'm not racist! Why is this my responsibility? And back and forth it would go. As Ziad writes, almost always we would reach an impasse, and I was exhausted, and they were just as committed to the idea of having nothing to do with racism as they were before. We said last week that it is our deepest desires that define us. It is our hunger that determines how we live. If we desire to be certain, then we will be obsessed with certainty. If we desire to always be right, to always win the argument, we will be obsessed with being right and winning. But if it is our desire that all of God's beloved are allowed to live as God's beloved children, regardless of how they look, that is the only way to bring an end to racism. Not to defend ourselves, but to offer ourselves. Not to convince others that we are not racist in our hearts, but to live as God's beloved with God's beloved. It is tempting to claim an identity for ourselves. It is tempting when the entire world seems so uncertain to take comfort by defining who we are and to let the world know who we aren't. But if our primary concern is how the world will see us, we can easily find ourselves getting locked into never-ending debates. We can actually be our own obstacles to the progress we hope to see. Psychiatrist Willard Galen has called identification the halfway house between self-love and other love. That is where Jesus found himself during his earthly ministry, a halfway house between his own belovedness and the belovedness of the rest of creation. He claimed his identity as God's beloved with one hand, while keeping the other hand open in service of others. He was certain enough to not be distracted by endless debate, but not so certain that he needed to convince others by eating rocks in the desert. To be God's beloved, we have to be certain enough to claim God's grace, and we must also be flexible enough to learn how to offer that grace to others. The best we can do is identify with the dialogue, with the process, to feed on every word that comes from God and deepen our relationships with one another as God's beloved children. We hold fast with one hand to our convictions, always leaving the other hand open. Not to push and not to convince, but to simply offer a hand to anyone in need of it. Friends, this is the path God has laid before us. It is the path that Jesus shows us how to walk. It is the path that we are gifted to choose.